Hello.
I think people are getting a hang of breakouts a little more now as we're getting through the conference.
I was counting on that I'd have it figured out by the time we got here. So,
takes every system is different. It's so much fun.
And I'll warn you, between our last session and this one, I had to take a nap, so I'm still kind of not quite together.
Yes, and I'm for me it's a bit late, so and I had a very busy day. So anyway,
thank you. Of course it's late. Thanks for doing this. Hi, Mustafa.
Hi, Mustafa.
Is it the members tell us who's here? Oh, okay. Yes, it does. Okay, great.
Yeah. So there is that.
Brigitte is here from Granularity. Great. I don't see someone here from Metadata.
Oh, they may have both gone into the other group in that case.
Okay. That'd be so. Brigitte, we weren't 100% sure what Keith Jeffries was going to share, and we were interested in the fact. Oh, here comes Keith.
Oh, he's Keith.
And we were interested in the fact that he actually took the path of granularity metadata. So that was really kind of, okay, that's cool. We can do that. If anyone's interested in putting on their video, you're welcome to do that. Keith Jeffrey, I'm glad you joined us. Mustafa, I have to find out how you got so many like points on your account. There must have been there must have been like prizes somewhere that you could click on.
I haven't worked that out either.
Yeah.
I have enough problem trying to keep control of the sessions and.
Oh, the posters, of course. I have to go look at the posters. Okay, thanks, Mustafa. So shall we dive in on our first question?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, right. It's late for you. Okay. It's easier for me. All right. So I hope you're all in the notes. And the first question's coming in. We're going to look at metadata first. And these are some notional questions. And Keith Jeffries, you can help us navigate this based on your talk, which the first time I looked at it, I'm like, oh, he took the granularity path. And then as you were giving the talk, I'm like, of course he took the granularity path. This makes a lot of sense. But our intention was to try to look more, maybe even a little bit higher level, possibly naively at a higher level, at what within the FAIR context, what the word rich metadata or robust metadata means. And if we put that in context for a framework, what is that exactly? And if anyone's tried to navigate that, and I'm glad Keith Jeffries here, what do you think that means exactly?
I mean, even in the Force 11 principles and later expanded by the Data Maturity Model Working Group, rich data was defined as a plethora of attributes. So lots and lots of attributes. But it's more than that because, for example, if you take I3 of the principles, that implies a rich relationship between data and data, or metadata and data, or more generally, if you generalize it, between any digital object and any other digital object. So what we're talking about is, in fact, a rich metadata is enough metadata to allow you to achieve the purpose you want, whether it's just to discover something or whether it's to totally autonomically process something. So it has to cover that whole range. And it consists, in my experience, of those characteristics of the metadata, or those properties that allow you to do discovery, access, interoperability, and reuse, taking into account provenance, curation, and any restrictions like licenses. So rich metadata should be able to cover all of that. The implication is that things like doubling core are not rich, and things like a highly extended DCAT are rich. Just to give you some examples.
That is super helpful. And I got a lot of your words. I can type really quickly, but I'm fairly certain I didn't get all of your words. If you could,
I'll have a quick look. Yeah.
Would you? Yes. And you characterized it really well, and then it really does go to the community for what that means, what enough means.
Yeah.
And I'm glad Mustafa's here, because you walk into that. Well, what for this repository is serving the community? What does that mean exactly? And I feel like that same sort of idea applies here.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shelley, if I may comment, and I'm sure other people on the session can comment on this, maybe even with more expertise than I can. But clearly, an essential concept in the context of preservation and the mission of repositories in maintaining fairness of data over time, the concept of
that's basically it. Yeah.
The concept of a designated
and
community,
in terms of
really
robustness,
important.
That means that the metadata has to be sufficiently strong or resilient that it supports all those things you wish to do, depending on the richness. So the robustness aspect, to me, implies things like curation and provenance. Curation to make sure that the digital object and indeed its metadata are there, preserved, even if the digital object goes away, so-called tombstone metadata, and the provenance, so that you know that you can trust the robustness of the metadata and the digital object, i.e. you know how it got to the state in which it currently is. So for me, robustness is very much to do with preservation, curation, provenance, those aspects of metadata.
And Mustafa, you were talking about the designated community a moment ago.
Yes, indeed.
Sorry, say again?
Can you hear Mustafa, Keith?
Yeah.
Okay, stand by, Keith. Mustafa's talking.
Yeah, so going back to the concept of a designated community, I was insisting on the fact that this concept is important to define the richness and to define the boundary of that richness of metadata. I think one level is defining the richness of metadata for reuse by the designated community, which means the community that basically generated the data and that needs it in a certain context with a certain knowledge base. Going beyond that to enable reuse beyond that designated community requires even more richness. So I think it is important when we talk about rich metadata to define the boundary of reuse to be able to really handle that concept of richness and define that concept of richness.
Can you extend a little bit, Mustafa? I really appreciate that word boundary that you've introduced. That's the first time I've heard that. Can you, like, for instance, we talk about, you do the best you can with the particular discipline you're in, but if another discipline wants to use your data, you can't foresee what they'll need. And if you could expand on that a little bit.
I think that's exactly right, Shelley. You can't really foresee the needs of another community for the reuse of your data set, I mean, outside of your community. That's why providing as much as you can in terms of richness for the data, so more context, the more context you provide, the more reuse beyond the designated community you will enable. But I think, again, going back to that fairness level where we put the bar, that's why I talked about boundary. You cannot really expect more than enabling reuse within the designated community. The rest is a bonus, if I may.
I agree with that. I think that because you can't see into the future. You have no idea.
May I jump in?
Thank you, Keith. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Mustafa. Yeah, I like a lot of what you said, but I think if you've got two communities, A and B, each have their own metadata systems and so on, then there's a push and a pull technology. So the question is, should community A make their metadata suitable not only for themselves, but also for community B and C and D and so on? Or should they just concentrate on making it suitable for themselves and assume that if community B wants to utilize community A digital assets, then they will provide a way to describe the community A digital assets in a language or form that's suitable for community B? In other words, the question is, where is the translation done to make the assets available to a given community?
That's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard that described like that you could actually try to figure out how to do the translation. And I wonder, do you mean things like mapping particular vocabularies?
Sure. I mean, mapping both the syntax and the semantics.
Okay.
Syntax being the structures and semantics being the meaning, to use simple terms. But it is a really serious problem. I mean, for example, if you take the 4-character lexical string bond, B-O-N-D, it means very different things in chemistry, in economics, in sociology, and in entertainment. And I'm sure you could all imagine the examples. So this is a real problem. I mean, you have to, and so then that's why I repeat the question: should community A try to generate their metadata so it's suitable also for communities B, C, D, and E, or should they do it optimally for A and assume that B or C or D will put in the effort to make a translation between the community A asset description and the language of asset description used in community B or C or D? Of course, you can simplify it all by having something canonical and rich that they can all convert to, and that probably is the way ahead, but I don't think we're near that yet.
All right, I think that will be a lovely plan, like an idea to head towards. Can I direct us to our next prompt?
Yes, sorry, and I think I just saw Brigitte raised her hand, or not? Is that right?
Yeah. I just wanted to chip in on that. So I think this idea of having something global, even if it's just very, very small and minimal, is very important for certain applications, especially for discovery. So that people can even understand that there is an asset there and identify its name and some very, very basic attributes. And I also think it's important to, maybe the line is blurring there a little bit between what is metadata and what is documentation. Because documentation is usually, and for social science where I'm working at, documentation is still in PDF format most of the time. And it's the number one thing. So our understanding of rich metadata is a link to that document. So I think it has to be understood that there are different ways of doing that, and not all of them end up with some sort of machine readable RDF graph at the current time. But I think it's still necessary to have some sort of global idea of what research data is, so people can even identify it as such.
So thank you, Brigitte. That's really helpful. Let's see, we're 20 after. We still have 30 minutes, right, Keith?
We have 30 minutes left. We have quite a few prompts to go. So I do wonder, we probably won't be able to cover everything. And I think it will be worth also spending some time on granularity. So
right, this time is for both. Okay, maybe should we hop to granularity now? Or actually, let me ask one more question and then we'll hop to granularity. So the second item that we have in the prompts is reviewing the existing metadata standards to determine if a community standard exists. And I wonder, either Keith or others who are on the call, I mean, if someone wanted to right now, perhaps within the RDA recommendations or others, where would we start to think about what the definition of robust metadata for our designated community looks like? Can we do that yet?
Can you maybe rephrase the question?
Let's say a researcher were to come to, we're running the data help desk at EGU right now. The researcher came to you and said, my research is this, my data is this, where's my metadata standards? How would I direct? It's hard. It's hard. So to give you a sense of what I found, if you find a domain repository, they've got their standards for how they curate the data and what they ask for from those researchers. But if you don't have a domain repository, there are some, like for instance, the Data Curation Network has some primers, and I think there's some other, Marta Teprick has her group of repositories is working on a set of primers, but I'm not sure. I feel like this needs to be far more robust, if we could overuse that word.
Yeah, so my go-to, so that happens sometimes because not all social science data is surveys, and what we usually do is that we, just as you said, try to find a repository that is that already has that kind of data, and then try to use what they're doing, or advise to use what they're doing. But that's kind of automatic because it's usually a requirement to deposit in that repository in the first place. But yeah, I do feel like there's a certain move to not look too hard for domain-specific repositories and just go to Zenodo in many cases. And of course, you have metadata that is rich in a Zenodo kind of way, which has usually long descriptions that are not very structured and these sorts of things. Yeah, so that's in practice what has been happening where in my domain.
But could we say this is making the easy way out? Could we just point them to the metadata standards directory and say, oh, just use one of these standards and you're good, you've done your job, it's robust metadata? Or is that not sufficient, and would you need more guidance than just saying, go to the standards directory and pick a standard?
So even in social science, which I'm very, very familiar with, I just had a call this morning for 1 hour trying to figure out with someone else what standard to use, and we did not come to a conclusion. I don't think a list will do it. I'm sorry. So it's a complex problem, and just having a list of things is maybe a good starting point, but it's not the end of the discussion. I am afraid.
Especially if you are not familiar with metadata. I'm looking at the vocab. I actually didn't know this resource existed, and I'm looking at the vocabulary. And if you don't know what you're looking at as a researcher, I mean, they're talking about different ISO standards. I mean, I think I would just close this window and put my data in Zenodo.
Yeah, I actually think that's in many cases the smartest way to go about it. So
Yeah.
I think the key thing about the metadata standards catalog is that if people can find something there they can use, that saves the proliferation of metadata standards, which is the last thing we need. So,
yeah,
there's encouragement to use something that's there already.
yeah, I think where this is really, really useful is that before you invent your own metadata standard, please look there at the very minimum, because also again in social science I mean, right now we're all more or less on DDI, but what kind of DDI, and also what would be really helpful is to have example data. So we're currently in the process of collecting example metadata for these standards. This could give people an idea of how it actually looks like, and not just a specification document. So yeah, that's it's a little bit more complicated than just having a registry. But yeah, I agree. It's definitely going in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, let's move to granularity, but I do want to ask if Mustafa could maybe type something in the document. And the question I have is, how has Fair is Fair thought about implementing metadata requirements? I'm wondering if there's some thinking about the operational process. I'm hoping, I don't know if you've gotten there yet, but it would be interesting to know if you've thought that through. Okay, granularity. Can we go there? So excited.
Of course we go there. It's fun.
It is fun.
I agree.
All right.
Just to put a bit of perspective around this, I think one of the reasons we got this question in the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group was just because people were asking us, well, it's great you have a maturity assessment, but at what level do you need to assess? Is this at the level of a small data set, or a larger data collection, or even larger aggregation? At which level do you actually do that assessment? And that was for us a complicated question to answer, and that's why we said, well, we need to dig into this a bit deeper with the community. So that was really the trigger for this discussion here now.
Keith, can we duck it by saying the granule is the amount of the digital object that is of interest for the purpose at hand?
I think it's a great question, not answering it, to be honest. I mean, asking these kinds of granularity questions kind of presupposes that you already have an infrastructure to even define certain levels of granularity. So saying that, yeah, we do have identifiers, yeah, we do have structures that these granularity levels live in. Now, what are we going to do with it in practice? So this is actually maybe one step further. So in our session, we had the question like, oh yeah, why don't you just break everything down to the lowest level and live there? And that's not the ideal place to be, because then you have billions of granules and they're really hard to handle. So the question is really like, yeah, so given that we kind of understand how objects exist and how they can interact with each other and how they can be interconnected, what do we do in practice? How do we carve everything up?
Can I make a request? The person who's typing for us, do you mind coming down a few lines down to here? I'll highlight it. Breakout B notes. Just grab your words and bring them down, because we'll have the other group coming in shortly, I'm sure. And I think they're going to want to. Yes, you got it. Okay, whoever that is just figured out what I said. Thank you so much.
Let me give an example of a dynamic granule as I see it. So I'm making a query across 3 different repositories with similar data sets but different metadata standards, and I managed somehow to work out how to do it. So now what I have, because of my query, is a set of records at each of these 3 repositories that are the ones that are of interest to me for my scientific question. Now I have 3 granules. Now what do I do with them? I obviously need provenance information showing where they've come from. I need curation information, where they're going to be stored. I need descriptive information about them all. and I need to harmonize that to make sure I understand how the three are related. And then I need to somehow pull those records from those data sets, I'm using data as an example, to wherever I am, or to some supercomputer center to do the work I need to do. Now I think this is a different way of thinking of granules. So instead of saying a granule is something that is an administrative unit, like a file or a collection, this is saying a granule is something I need to do my job.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that isn't a more fruitful approach. It may be that a collection is what you need to do your job.
Yeah, so the sort of thing that everything goes the direction that things turn out to be is that they have to be multiple ways to derive hierarchies, and one of them is, of course, on the work level, like from the researcher's perspective, how it is useful for researchers to carve these things up and also to put them back together. Because, I mean, maybe you're not talking about 3 data sources, maybe you're talking about 1,000 data sources. And then, of course, you're not going to cite all 1,000 data sources in the paper. So this is one of these issues that come up in these cases. And on the other hand, when you're a repository, you don't want to you only want to have a limited amount of objects that make sense, because obviously you could carve up every single data set that you have into its granules, and then you'd have a lot of stuff, but nobody would be able to find anything anymore. So these are the sort of like the use cases that we are struggling with. And yeah, it's useful to look at these things from very different perspectives to find what kind of solutions we're looking at, because probably it's not going to be just one, but because the perspectives and the requirements are very different. But to have as few solutions as possible to get a grip on all these issues. Yeah. But what was the question about? And we're not hearing so much from the audience. So I would really like to hear from everyone. So in the audience, please, in your experience, what are the granularity? So what kind of criteria do you use to determine how to carve up a data set? So what is a data set in your community? How do you decide that? Or is it something that is just decided by some sort of emergent process? How is it going on? So if you have an answer to that, please either maybe just post it into the chat or write it into the document. That would be really helpful for us to get an idea of how this is, of what is happening in the larger community. There's a lot of chat going on here. I haven't really.
I guess there's something hidden behind this. It's whether we're talking about, I mean, if you consider an end user at a laptop at their desk in their university, and they're trying to access stuff on repositories that are remote and distant, the question is, how much can they do? I mean, if the repository just offers download of granules, where a granule may be a file or a set of records or a collection or whatever, is that what we really want? Or actually, should we expect all repositories to offer services such the end user can access a service which, for example, reduces the size of a data set to only those records of interest to the query?
Let's go there. Yes. So in a different group, coming at it from a different point of view, how do you? So I've gathered my data together. I've selected out the pieces that are useful for my research. I'm about to publish my paper. How do I cite what I used? How do I actually?
Exactly.
Right. It is that it's literally impossible. I mean, you
unless the
can't do it.
granules have a bit of a UURPID, a universally unique resolvable permanent identifier,
Right.
of some kind.
Right,
So
which is an overhead. It's a
yeah,
management overhead from the repository, which is probably for many too much.
right. But the RDA citation group said you don't do it the way I've just said with the UURPID. You actually do it by the citation being a query.
Yes, and the group I'm working with is finding that difficult.
It's incredibly difficult. I mean, it's academically correct, but engineeringly impractical.
Well,
Right.
there are some. I mean, we're currently implementing it. So if you know why it's failing us, so please tell me now, because that. So the idea is that you also store the queries and the results of the queries, and then have something like a static tombstone page with just the query results. So you don't run into the problem of, oh, we are using now a new database, so your query doesn't work anymore. So this is sort of like the thing that we were thinking about, because obviously we know that we change our systems every maybe like 10 years, and that seems like not very sustainable if we actually allow people to give us actual queries in a language that maybe in 10 years nobody uses anymore.
That was one of the main issues, that if you stored just the query, that it was so easy to break the point of persistence.
Yeah, but if you just say, okay, we have, I mean, for us it works pretty well, because our data sets are always like on the smallish side of things, right? So we have like 1 megabyte, we're just huge. So what we do is we just say, okay, so whatever the result of your query was, and no matter how many data sets you used, we're just storing that, and here is your hash key, and now you can forever retrieve that, because it's a web page and it lives on this web server, and it probably will live on that web server in 200 years, because why should we ever delete it? So this is the idea there, but we are not finished yet with implementing it. I keep on thinking that there must be some sort of trick or a thing that we haven't thought about that kind of prevents that.
So Mustafa's thinking this through in the chat, and I think maybe for me, I'm coming at it from the reuse case. I didn't control how the data was preserved, and now I'm reusing it, but I didn't use, like, for instance, if it was your data, Mustafa, which of course I love, because you're just really detail oriented, and I love using your data, just so you know. I didn't use it all. I only used a part of it. So I would have cited your original data, but then I have to figure out how to identify what I actually used. And
yeah, Shelly, sorry, then I misunderstood your earlier example. I thought you were talking about the researcher at the stage of publication, and then how to define the granularity level for the data sets underlying a publication. And in my mind, at that stage, you have already basically defined the granules, because they're intrinsically linked to your research, right? So if you are publishing, you're communicating with your peers, you're giving them basically the tools and the resources to reproduce if they want to reproduce, to understand if they want to understand, and so on. So your granules are defined by that, by the context, by the research. And again, it is within your community, within what we call in the repository world, the designated community context. But if you're coming at it from a reuser perspective, which might be reusing your data sets in a completely different context, I mean, if you're using it if you're coming from the same community, then those granules would I would say, be a perfect match if you have a perfect publication with perfect underlying data sets. But if you're coming from a different community, then it's a completely different story. The data sets might fit your purpose, and it might not fit your purpose. Likewise with the granules, they might fit your level of reuse or the type of reuse you're envisaging for the data sets, or they might not match it. And here, you can't expect to find the granules that would fit your reuse scenario. You might find the granule at the level of your reuse scenario, but you might find it at a different level. And then you have to work with either the data producer, or you repurpose the data set, or if you can, but then you can't have always the perfect match, at least when you're coming to the granularity level.
Yep. And Brigitte, that's where you came in, right? That's where you were like, okay, here's my query, but here's my static version, so that it's very clear what I used. And if you could go ahead a little bit more.
This is just our implementation of what the data citation group has recommended. So this is what they're actually saying, and it took us a while to understand what this actually says, because the obstacle seems very clear. Like, if you have a query and you store the query, how are you going to, I mean, it's computational, but by storing the results of the query rather than the query itself, you have you circumvent that problem. Of course, I mean, it solves a lot of problems. For example, versioning. So one of the problems that we thought about, like, okay, you have a query, and then you run the same query 2 years later, but there's a new version of the data set, and suddenly things don't fit together anymore. And you can also expand that, and this is actually very important to us, because there's a lot of so Mustafa actually knows about that, because there's a lot of there's an idea that you also do the same with complex code, right? Like, you write an R script or even more complex stuff, and then you would want to document that, and of course, at the very least at this point, we cannot guarantee that we will execute your script the same way forever. So what we can do is we can store the script, we can store the result of the script, and then people can try to, we can even, do something like store a Docker file of a machine that runs the script as well. So there is some sort of reproducibility, but that is, of course, it's much easier to just store the result and the documentation of the result, rather than having the whole machine and
Well, let me ask you, the problem that's vexing me is, if looking at your particular solution, which I think is just fine for the purpose that you have implemented it, how do I then make sure, so let's add a little bit more complication. So you ran the query, and you pulled from different data sets at different levels of granularity that were produced by different people. How do I then give credit back to each of those folks where we reuse their data in order to demonstrate the value of that data? This is my vex. This is where my head has been. How do I make sure there's credit?
This is a thing that we also kind of got out of there. What we do right now is that we make a list of all the data sets with a DOI that we know about that are involved in this,
in order to give credit, even though you only use part of it.
But that obviously doesn't really give credit, because it's not automated, and Scopus doesn't see it, and all these other things. But
well, I'm talking to Scopus, so I'll take that end, but it's just making sure that we can actually get credit. Okay, all right. So this
is actually a lot more complicated, because we have a lot of cases where the data is not easily accessible. So we don't actually have the data per se, and people have to, for example, sign certain documents that they will, because it's, for example, not anonymized data. So people have to sign that they're going to use it only for research purposes or whatever. And so we cannot even show people the results without them having signed the document first. And then, of course, one of the ways that we also looked into is to just give them the machine that does it, but they have to get a hold of the data themselves. So basically, you just and we built a very complex system for that, and it's really cool. For this one particular case, so the idea was that there were I think like 6 or 7 studies, and they were all using the same things but differently, and we wanted to make a machine that would put them all together. And of course, but the problem was that we didn't own any of these data sets. So basically all we had was a script that would put them together, and then we would have to give people very exact instructions on how to get a hold of the data sets themselves. So it's endlessly complex, because just to make that work is just really, really hard. And
well, we're down to 4 minutes. So Brigitte, this part is meant to benefit you and your working group. Based on these conversations and how we're thinking about granularity, Keith has added in depth of metadata that I'm just grateful that we know Keith. So, I truly appreciate his viewpoint here and his experience. How can we, what can we do in these last couple minutes that would benefit your working group?
Yeah, so right now we are looking for solutions, where you're looking for use cases. If you have an interesting story to tell, and maybe you didn't say it right now, but please just use this document or contact us directly and share your story. Yeah, so because we really want to have like a broad overview of how different communities think about these issues, and how we can try to synthesize that. Because what we already discovered is that people from all different kinds of domains came together, and we talked about it, and we kind of had the same slides on many issues. So I think that there are very many commonalities there, and but I think it would be great to have more than 4 or 5 people. More like a dozen would be great.
So maybe join the working group and bring the use cases.
Absolutely, do join the working group.
Okay.
But if you don't want to, maybe just visit once and just make I don't know, 5 slides, and okay, granularity issues here are like that, or maybe just write us an email and say, okay, this is what we're doing. That would be really, really helpful. We're also preparing a survey where we have some, super special questions also to do that, and if you have any ideas on that as well, that would be really great.
Something that comes to mind, and again, I'm glad Mustafa's here, is I think that domain repositories have grappled with this question of how to actually preserve the data, and I suspect that by community, they've made different decisions based on how they work with their communities.
That's correct. I think this is
And there's also core trust seal.
Yeah,
which gives a set of standards or a set of recommendations for.
I was about
that
to
would
mention,
be Mustafa, Keith. So give me a second there.
In also the core trust seal, you're right, Keith, but also in the context of the World Data System, because this group worked a lot with domain repositories in terms of trying to bring some kind of interoperability level, at least at the discovery layer. And the granularity aspect was a key. So providing recommendations and guidelines on where to set the granularity level for the data sets within the repositories. And actually, we have produced a working paper, Brigitte, and I'm happy to share with you. It's a bit old, but it might be useful in the context of
Please do share it, because I feel that a lot of these informations is really distributed, and this is one of the things that would be really super helpful. And I do try to keep in mind to get into the core trust seal. People, I actually do know some of them, and ask them on more information on granularity. But yeah, if you would just share that either in the chat or just send me an email, that would be super appreciated.
Mustafa would be a really good contact for core trust seal, by the way.
Yeah, I just emailed this morning with Jonas Recker, who's a colleague of mine. So
yeah, he's the chair of the board. If you have contact with him, that's great. And
So I'm literally sitting at the source. So this morning he emailed me about some technical issues.
Good. Well, all of us, please go ahead and hit the exit button to go back to the main room. And I thank you so much for this robust and rich conversation. I hope you get the joke there.
Really?